Many historians have different numbers for this battle, some claiming that both sides had more than 20,000 men, while unreliable Froissart wrote in his chronicles numbers like 70,000. Modern historians have much lower numbers, with both sides having around 10,000 soldiers, with Anglo-Gascon forces probably having some advantage. Both sides arrayed their forces in 3 lines, laid out in a comparable manner. The front line of Enrique's army was led by Du Guesclin in person, with picked men-at-arms and crossbowmen. To oppose this, Edward put his brother John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, with infantry and archers. In Enrique's second line were 2 flanking forces of Spanish light cavalry mixed with a corps of heavies, led by Don Tello and Carrillo de Quintana. At this time, Spain was beginning to experiment with light cavalry, later to develop into the genitors of the Renaissance for skirmishing purposes, an idea that had dropped out of contemporary European military thinking. The center of the line was led by Enrique himself, with the cream of his heavy cavalry. The Black Prince was also in the second line together with Pedro, again mixed infantry and archers. Flanking him were 2 similar forces under Capital de Buch and Sir Thomas Percy. The third line of Enrique's force consisted of Spanish infantry of mixed capability, ranging from well-armored professionals to reluctant conscripts. On Edward's side, the third line was led by the King of Majorca, Jaume IV, and the Count Armagnac. In all 3 divisions, on Edward's sides, the men-at-arms on foot were drawn up in the center, with the archers on either flank. As soon as the Black Prince was satisfied with the dispositions, he ordered his entire army to dismount and had the horses sent to the rear. Realizing that enemy has superiority in range units, Du Guesclin led his vanguard and they smashed into Lancaster's division. The English longbowmen dispersed the crossbowmen, but once the melee has started, the press was such that they could contribute little. Duke of Lancaster and Du Guesclin remained locked together throughout the remainder of the battle. Fighting hand to hand, it was bloody business, with heavily armored infantry butchering each other with no room to maneuver, only to push forward. The Spanish flanking cavalry forces then charged the advancing flanks opposing them. The heavy contingent held back, while the light cavalry harassed the sides of the opposition and probed for a weak spot along the front, seeking to create a gap where the heavy cavalry could drive in a wedge and smash the entire formation. This system has proved very successful against infantry armed with spears or the slow-loading crossbow. Against longbowmen, it proved disastrous. As the Spaniards moved along the front, avoiding hand-to-hand combat and hurling their javelins, they were shot down in droves. Surprised, they drew back to organize and suffer still more heavily, with missiles from longbows easily penetrating their light armor and killing men and horses alike. As they wavered, the heavy cavalry leaders took in charges to restore morale and never even reached the units they were charging. Volleys of fire from English longbows halted the cavalry charge as many horsemen were knocked down as their horses were hit. The demoralization of the Spanish flanks was now complete, the cavalry remaining wheeled about and fled the field. Percy and de Buch now capitalized on their momentary advantage in the best possible way by joining up to make a cohesive front. They moved in unhurriedly together and managed to link behind the Guesclin force, still battling Duke of Lancaster. The men-at-arms turned inwards to take Du Guesclin's men from the rear, while the archers faced out against the inevitable Spanish counterattack. It was not long in coming. Enrique realized that Percy de Buch line had to be broken. 3 times his knights charged, and each time the charge faded to nothing under the withering hail of arrows. Edward moved up his own central division to increase the pressure on Du Guesclin. Desperately, Enrique ordered up his infantry mass, but again it never came to grips with the forces of Edward and Pedro. Despite the disparity in numbers, the archers waited calmly until the infantry were in range and loosed salvo after salvo. The infantry faltered, broke and fled. Realizing the battle was lost, Enrique went too. The Spanish cavalry were able to scatter, but the infantry could only escape over the narrow bridge of Najera. As the fresh 3rd Division swept around past Percy and chased after them, many Spaniards died both in the press and by drowning. Du Guesclin did not surrender until he realized that the Spanish army had gone. His forces had been surrounded throughout the battle. 1/4 of its number were dead, practically all the others injured. By mid-afternoon, the battle was over, and the English had time to count their prisoners. Enrique of Trastámara had escaped, but many knights, including the masters of the great military orders of Santiago and Calatrava, plus Bertrand du Guesclin and Marshal d'Otrarem, were in Anglo-Gascon hands. The prince had great trouble preventing Pedro the Cruel from executing the prisoners out of hand, while the prince himself threatened to execute Marshal d'Otrarem, who had still not paid his ransom due after his capture at Poitiers, and should not have taken up arms against the prince until this debt had been discharged. D'Otrarem avoided this fate by pointing out rather bluntly in the circumstances that he was not fighting against the Prince of Wales, but against the prince's paymaster, Pedro the Cruel. After the Battle of Nájera, Pedro the Cruel recovered the Kingdom of Castile, Enrique refugeed at Aragon and afterly at France. Pedro started a fierce repression, which earned him his second nickname, the Cruel. The Spanish campaign culminating at Najera was a spectacular success militarily. A professional English army had crossed inhospitable terrain in the depths of winter, and once again had defeated a French-sponsored enemy with few casualties of its own. Politically and economically, however, it was a disaster. King Pedro and Prince Edward parted ways over the funding of the expedition, after Pedro refused to transfer the promised territory to Edward. What hurt even more was Pedro's refusal to reimburse the cost of this expedition, and the Black Prince returned to Bordeaux, having contracted an illness on this expedition that would ail him until his death in 1376. When the Black Prince returned to Aquitaine, a new rebellion started. Enrique and Du Guesclin returned to lead the rebellion. They reorganized their army at Peypetrus Castle. Then, with the help of many Castilian rebels and Bertrand du Guesclin's Frenchmen, they defeated Pedro at the Battle of Montiel on 14 March 1369. The night after, Pedro the Cruel was treasoned and died at a personal combat with his half-brother. After the death of Pedro, Enrique II fought against the English. His descendants also took part in the 100 Years' Wars on the French side. Castilian fleet defeated the English one at several battles, like in La Rochelle in 1372 and 1419. But about this, perhaps a little more in our future videos. If you have any suggestions and questions, feel free to leave a comment, and if you like our videos, leave a like and subscribe to our channel. You can also support us on Patreon and help us improve our content, for which we would be very grateful. Thank you for watching and see you in our next videos.